Okay, so to continue and finish the Pentateuch, um, and we'll come to the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy, the word Deuteronomy is basically the second law. So Deutero is the second, and then the nomos is the law, as you already know. So the the interesting thing about when you look at the book of Deuteronomy is that it's not necessarily just presenting law, but rather it is the book of the covenant. And the term covenant in of itself, اللي هي كلمة العهد، احنا قطعنا عهد مع بعض. It's very interesting because the Hebrew is very similar to the Arabic. That when they look at the original Hebrew word for covenant, covenant is different than agreement. يعني agreement احنا اتفقنا مع بعض، كان عندنا اتفاقية مع بعض. Covenant is a little bit hard, a little bit even more than that, because actually the word originally meant to shackle, to bond, or to cut, where basically represents an unbreakable covenant and union. And that's why, for example, even في العربي نقول إن إحنا قطعنا عهد مع بعض. قطعنا عهد، كلمة قطع العهد is like very much in the Hebrew, which the covenant in the Old Testament was always associated with a sacrifice. So basically that they would cut, like for example, in some of the other ancient Near East literature, where they cut a donkey in two parts. We know this very well from the experience of Abraham with God, when God put on Abraham a deep sleep, and then he told, before that, he told him to cut the animals in two, and then God walked in the middle. So this is kind of, in a sense, it's an oath. The Deuteronomy talks about the covenant as an oath. And in this oath, it is cut, that this cut as a sacrifice, you're saying that I am swearing an oath by my blood. Very interesting when you look at the oath that God had with Abraham, where the animals were cut into two. It was only God who walked in the middle. And God is telling Abraham at that time, I'm taking an oath by my blood, which is the blood of his son, Jesus Christ. That's how God fulfilled the oath at that time. But in general, the word, the Hebrew word for this is to make a covenant is karat berith, which to cut a covenant, which in في العربي هنقطع عهد مع بعض. So it's very, very similar in the Hebrew. In general, the Deuteronomy, the liberal scholarship looks at Deuteronomy basically as the book that was found by King Josiah when he is mentioned in 2 Kings chapter 22-23 that they found the book of Deuteronomy. What we believe at that time is that the book of Deuteronomy, because of the worship of the idol and the poor state of the Israel nation, that they had stopped reading the biblical text. And at that time, after many years of ignoring the biblical text, they found the book of Deuteronomy, and that was a copy that was not read for a time. But it was not said it was written at that point. However, the Christian liberal scholarship took this as an indicator that Deuteronomy was written at the time of King Josiah. You have to understand that they look at this and they say, well, you know what? You read the whole Pentateuch. You read from Genesis to Deuteronomy. And you can see that Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers has a certain vocabulary, has a certain style, has a certain way of writing, and then Deuteronomy is completely different. Deuteronomy, the way that it reads almost like a sermon, a very long sermon, a very long speech. And they say that the way that is written is very different than the other 4 chapters of the Pentateuch. Hence, it's a totally different author. And I don't think that this is really a good argument. The reason why is that Deuteronomy, in the way that we look at it, most likely it was a long sermon delivered by Moses. Moses spoke to them at that time, especially if we believe that Deuteronomy, as I'm going to show you, was written for the people entering the promised land. So this was the generation that was born in the wilderness, not the generation that came out from Egypt. Most likely, you can imagine Moses giving them his farewell speech. This is like a father telling his kids and his grandkids, God has promised us you're going to get to the promised land, and this is my farewell sermon to you. So as a farewell sermon, it has the style of a sermon, okay, and then he wrote it down after that in Deuteronomy. So the fact that it has a different style, I would not take it as a proof that Moses didn't write it, but rather I would think of it that Moses came to a stage in his life where he realized he's not going to make it into the promised land, and he gave his farewell speech in this last year of his life to the Israelites who are entering the land of Canaan. So that's, we just talked about this. The Deuteronomy also, and this is also the liberal scholarship, they believe that Deuteronomy as a book is not just by itself what was written at that time of the King Josiah, but basically was a part of what was called a Deuteronomic history, or also known as the Deuteronomistic history. What is this? Because you're going to read this a lot in the books of scholars. Basically, they say that this author, who is labeled D, you remember now we have J, E, D, and P. The one who wrote D, from their perspective, basically came around the time of pre-exile, at the time of King Josiah. And as an author, he was basically struggling with people worshiping idols, people not remembering the laws of God, people not remembering the covenant. And he tried to bring people back into the covenant. So what he wrote as an author, he gathered all the oral traditions of the history of Israel. When they followed the covenant, they were treated well by God. When they did not follow the covenant, they were punished by God. And then also he gathered the book of Deuteronomy and wrote in the book of Deuteronomy based on this tradition to tell them, here is the covenant itself and this is what it looks like. So he was trying to explain to people at that time, be careful. If you don't listen to the covenant of God, if you don't listen to the history that we've had with God, we could end up being punished by God. And that's where this Deuteronomic history comes. So as I said, this is a proposed author who they propose, as a liberal scholarship, they propose that this author wrote Deuteronomy and also wrote mainly from Joshua to 2 Kings, as basically a track record of how Israel at times followed the covenant and at other times failed to follow the covenant. Definitely, we do not agree with this assessment. And the reason why, so basically, where do we stand as a traditional Christian perspective? Well, number one, as I talked about, that we believe that Deuteronomy was Moses' farewell sermon, and it had a lot of meaning at that time for the people who are entering into the land of Canaan. But the second thing, and this is where sometimes you find that ancient Near East civilization helps you into kind of actually dating things. They found that actually treaties اللي هي المعاهدات. So they found some ancient treaties from around the year 1500 before Christ. And these treaties, they had kind of a format. زي مثلا واحد بيكتب جواب للرئيس يقول له مثلا كذا كذا ومقدمه كذا كذا, and then you go into the way that the letter is written, and then you end in وتفضلوا بقبول وافر الاحترام. So there is a format how to write a formal letter, okay? And the same thing when you're like writing a CV or writing a resume. So in these treaties that were dated back to the 15th century before Christ, they had that form. The form was a title, basically, of the king who's writing this treaty. It's usually from a king to his people. And this treaty is one way, okay? It's not from like any double way. It's from a king to the people who are underneath him, okay? So this king would usually write it, that they would write basically the title, I am so-and-so, king and so-and-so, who is writing this treaty. And then it would write a historical prologue. You know what? I conquered you. I fed you. I took care of you. I did this and this and this to you. And then there is a point of stipulation, which basically says you need to follow this and this and this and this. And if you don't follow this, this is going to happen. If you're going to follow this, this is going to happen. And then there is usually a request for reading, which is basically you need to read this treaty, المعاهدة دي, you need to read it in front of everyone عشان عايز الناس كلها تسمع المعاهدة دي من الملك طالعة الناس كلها تسمعها. And usually you have to have witnesses when it's being read. You have to have witnesses. And then at the end, there's usually ends with curses and blessings. Curses to those who would not follow this treaty, and blessings to those who would follow this treaty. So this format, النظام of writing this, was very well known around 1500 before Christ. And it was the treaty form. And scholars have looked at actually Deuteronomy and found that this form is almost followed to the letter. So in some sense, it's kind of interesting because you would say, well, George, does that mean that Moses copied this way of writing from these treaties? Could be, because it's a method of treating. Just like I'm writing a newspaper article. I'm probably going to copy the way that people report in newspaper articles. But what I'm writing belongs to me. So I'm not saying that Moses copied the content. الcontent اللي هو بتاع اللي مكتوب. No, Moses is the author. بس طريقة الكتابة، طريقة العرض، طريقة التريتي نفسها مكتوبة, it could have taken it from what was known as a contemporary way. And if that's the case, then this really dates Deuteronomy to that early time, so about 1400 before Christ. So it really puts it as a Mosaic authorship. Because you can see over here, the preamble in chapter 1, ربنا بيقول لهم he's the great king. And then the historical prologue from chapter 1 to chapter 4, here in this prologue, God is telling them everything that happened in Exodus. Everything that happened in Exodus. And then stipulations, general and specific stipulations of here's what you need to do. And it goes from chapter 5 to chapter 26. خلي بالكم from the order. It goes in that same order. And then the blessings and the curses, فاكرين ساعتها كان ربنا قال لهم, you know what? Somebody has to stand on Mount Ebal and one on Mount Gerizim, and one is reading the curses and one is reading the blessings. And the people, okay, cross in between. لازم الناس كلها تسمع at this point the treaty. And then the witnesses, and here's the thing, ربنا شهد عليهم إيه؟ السماء والأرض. He made the heaven and the earth to be the witness of this treaty. The format of this, as in Deuteronomy, has been very well documented. And if that's the case, it puts Deuteronomy around 1400 to 1500. So it makes it a very ancient document. As said, it's a speech by Moses, okay? And then we just talked about how it ends, and then all the way to the final speech of Moses, to his final blessing and his death scene. This is the outline of the book of Deuteronomy. You can look into it, but really try to understand this structure of what's called the treaty, the vassal treaty, treaty اللي هي المعاهدة زي ما اتكلمنا. In what sense is Deuteronomos the repetition of the law? Because as I said, هي سفر التثنية, it's repeating the law, and you can definitely see here in Exodus 21 to 24, which is the original covenant law, how it's repeated in Deuteronomy at this point. However, some liberal scholars took this and they compared the law in 21 to 24 and then in Deuteronomy, and then found out that it's a bit more advanced, for there's a bit of addition. But they're trying to say, well, you know what? The original one in Exodus might have reflected what was happening in Sinai, and the Deuteronomy was reflecting more of the kingdom. So this matches it be written at the time of Josiah or the time of pre-exilic Israel kingdom. But that's not the case, because realistically, when you look at the difference reflects not necessarily a kingdom 4 or 5 centuries later, but actually the people of Israel when they arrived to Canaan. So for example, you look at, for example, over here in the law of Exodus in 23, demands that the farmers leave the land unplanted every 7th year, the law, the year of Sabbath, so that the poor can survive by finding some grain and wild growth to eat. The parallel law in Deuteronomy 15 adds elaborate regulations for forgiving debts owed by the poor every 7 years and expand the meaning to cover foreign borrowing and lending. So some of the liberal scholars say, well, here when it talks about foreign borrowing, it assumes that the people of Israel had developed at that time into a kingdom, and that kingdom is dealing with other foreign people, and they were borrowing. So then Deuteronomy was written during the King Josiah. I think this is not a fair assumption, because by the time the people of Israel were in Canaan, they already had some trade and negotiations with the people around them. And this trade involved within it some borrowing. So Deuteronomy would more refer to the people of Israel in Canaan at the time of Joshua and Judges, not necessarily at the time of King Josiah. Same thing also, Deuteronomy 15 and Exodus 21, you can read about it. But what these liberal Christian scholars are trying to say, that the context of Deuteronomy is far more sophisticated as a society that would match more the kingdom of Israel when it's more developed in the time of King Josiah, rather than the time of Joshua and Judges, where they're still farmers, very basic and simple people. I don't think that's the case, because realistically, it takes only 30 to 40 years of settlement for the life to develop and become more and more sophisticated. The purpose of Deuteronomy is basically as follows: to provide a restatement of the covenant. ربنا عمل عهد مع شعب بني إسرائيل when he took them out of Israel. In Deuteronomy, he's restating the covenant between God and Israel to the generation assembled in the plains of Moab prior to crossing the Jordan and the conquest of Canaan under Joshua. Most of the people in the generation that had heard and accepted the covenant at Sinai 38 years earlier had died. Their sons and daughters now needed to hear it for themselves and to make their own affirmation of loyalty to it. And this is why we believe Moses wrote Deuteronomy. Because, and I put myself, and I always, sometimes I contemplate in this a little bit. Moses must have struggled a lot that the people he came out from Egypt with, those are like his friends, his family, the people that he lived with all his life. واحد ورا التاني are dying. Everyone is dying. And he knows as himself, as Moses, that he's going to die himself. His brother Aaron died. And he's seeing this group of people that witnessed a miracle. دول اخواته، دول اصحابه، دول جيرانه. وكلهم واحد ورا التاني عمال يموت. But how he still inside his heart would have that hope and that promise and that living of the covenant, that he would stand up to his children, to the grandchildren. This is the generation, زي ما بيقولوا, they didn't hear the covenant 38 سنة فاتت at Mount Sinai. These are young kids, okay? And he would tell them in a sermon, the Deuteronomy, as a restatement of the covenant that had happened 38 years at Sinai. And trying to tell them at that point, he's trying to encourage them and warn them about what's going to happen in the land of promise at that point. And you can see over here, and this is Moses on Mount Nebo, where he died, that although he didn't enter the promised land, but God gave him that sight of that promise. You can see, and this is in the map, that Moses, the people of Israel, came from the bottom here, the land of Edom, the land of Moab, around the Dead Sea. And he stood over here at Mount Nebo, and where he could witness from the mountain the land of Canaan. He could witness the river Jordan and Jericho right beyond the river Jordan. And this is the river that Joshua had to cross. So the farewell speech, so we can really think of Deuteronomy as reflecting the last year of the life of a great servant as Moses. His last farewell message to the kids and the children and the young generation of Israel about how to keep the faith, how to keep the covenant, how to reinstate the covenant again before he dies on Mount Nebo. And then from there, Joshua takes them to cross to Jericho. So with that, we have really done a lot. We have covered a lot of ground. We've covered in 4 lectures a lot of the introduction to the scholarship. And then we've covered the Pentateuch and the 5 books of the Pentateuch. For the next couple of weeks, we're going to be taking 2 weeks of break. I think our next meeting, is Sunday, February 12th, I believe. It's on the calendar. Just look over in the calendar. But I would encourage all of you, try as much as you can to keep up at least with the primary reading. If you can't do if you can't do the advanced reading, which is Lawrence Boat's book, at least read the primary reading part. That's number 1. Try to get to your assignments. As I said in your own words, I'm giving you the option of Arabic or English. Number 3, I'll send you the link to the video, to this movie by PBS about the people of Israel. Over the next 2-3 weeks, try to watch it. It's very enlightening to understand the challenges that we face as biblical students, what we need to do to learn how to answer. And then also try to get to that map. You don't have to do it until almost the very end, but if you want to get to it from now, you can. Easiest way to search where these locations, where these cities and routes and whatnot, is just to go on online biblical geography website, and then you can find these. You can find them on maps, and then you need to mark and write down the name of the location. It's a great exercise in trying to memorize the map very well. So with that being said, if there are any questions, please feel free to text me the questions right now through a Q&A. But if we're doing well, we're going to call tonight and everyone get to bed. And I'll ask for your prayers for the mission trip to Kenya. We're leaving tomorrow. I've got about 16 people. Out of those 16, there are about 14 medical people and then 2 assistants. So ask your prayers for the group that God will give us a good service. Any questions? Okay. Well, it seems that things are good. So if everyone is okay that we can finish the meeting, just raise your hand.